them as securities and then using fractional reserve banking to loan them out 10 times 10 times 10. And Dr. Roberts agreed that it's in the hundreds of trillions. We're talking about total exposure, and that this black hole is so big. I mean, he was saying his prognosis is even worse than it had been. But then if they wouldn't have done what they did, it would have caused insolvency in U.S. Treasury notes and bonds, because the U.S. Treasury had already guaranteed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac previously. So your take on that?
Well, this is certainly true, but I try to look at it a little bit differently from that, because, you know, when you read the financial news now, you are reading commentators who are, you know, with all due respect, they're good commentators, good analysts, but it doesn't give me a whole lot of heartburn to think that this latest huge scam is going to take down the already existing scams, you know, of Treasury debt, of a $10 trillion national debt, of you know, hundreds of $1 trillion in derivatives. It doesn't bother me that the viability of all of these other disasters may be threatened by this latest disaster. I mean, suppose the whole financial system just collapses. You go into bankruptcy reorganization, you rebuild it, but that's not the real problem. If I could, I'd like to point out...
stay there. I want to talk about what the real problem is with Richard C. Cook, our guest, top analyst, economist dealing with this. We're going to skip this break for Infowars.com audio listeners and PrisonPlanet.tv viewers. People keep saying, well, how do I listen then? You go to Infowars.com and you click on those streams. Those are special streams. All right, we'll be right back. Okay, continue. I don't want to waste any time with you. Go ahead.
Okay. We've got a financial system that's built on debt. The financial system is just pieces of paper that represent promises that somebody's making to pay. And we've got trillions of these pieces of paper. We've got debt upon debt upon debt, a gigantic pyramid of debt that's now falling down. But on the other hand, we have a producing economy where people make real things. ExxonMobil produces gasoline, Microsoft produces computers, General Motors produces cars, and so on and so forth. The producing economy is where the real wealth of the nation should come from.
But let me stop you. Instead of this fiat currency and fiat liquidity that gives the bankers kingship, and I'm going to let you get to your economic solution point here, but I just want to add the caveat, they're not accidentally letting this Ponzi scheme get out of control. They want to fully take over and bankrupt the real physical economy so they get ownership, and the implosion is their economic weapon of warfare to get the scraps of the real economy they don't already control.
Well, yes, and that's exactly what this bankruptcy is going on, is doing. So we may fuss and fume about how it's threatening the Treasury securities and all that. You're right; they don't care. Now the problem is, for the last decade at least, and it goes back further, but particularly in the last decade, the United States economy has been built on the foundation of housing debt as its financial engine. Now, the reason they've done that is that decades ago, the international financial elite that runs the Western world decided that the United States would no longer be allowed to maintain its status as the world's great industrial democracy.
And they publicly stated that. Let me stop you again and just back you up. That's been stated over and over again. We're too greedy. We've got too much. We've got to have the center of power taken from us and brought into this global corporate structure. Go ahead.
Well, that's been kind of the cover story. But the problem was that the United States, as an industrial democracy, based upon the principles in the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, had built a system where people were free, where people had opportunity, where people could fulfill themselves. This was contrary to the concept of the one world collectivist empire that the financiers have been planning for decades.
And the imperialists actually back in the 1780s said this American system's horrible and it'll be the ruination of all of us if we don't end it as well.
That's right, and that was said again during the Civil War by the London financiers because Lincoln financed the Civil War with greenbacks and war bonds sold to the population. The London Times printed an editorial saying if the United States was not stopped, it would become the most powerful nation on earth, and it would undermine all the monarchies of the world. And so they've been trying to take down our system ever since, and now this is the final phase of that. It's the final phase of a very old plan to create the collectivist, one-world, socialist, communist state that they began to do when they financed the Bolshevik Revolution.
Let me stop you there. Let me stop you there. I want you to go back 30 seconds, and you're going to have 5 minutes. And when we come back, it'll be Aaron here alone with you. I'm going to give you the floor. When we come back right now, go back to that editorial in the London paper, and start over right now. Here we go. All right, Richard C. Cook, economist, analyst, written for major publications like the Washington Post, historian. You've got the floor for the next 5 minutes, and I'm going to leave. Aaron's going to come in here. Break down who's behind it, what the master plan is, the economic system, what they're setting up, why they want to bring down the U.S., how they've puffed us up with this imperial attitude, giving us this domestic haughty propaganda about how we're the boss, how they're setting us up to pull the carpet out from under us, how the war has been meant to demonize us internationally. You were talking about that during the last segment. Please wrap it up for us.
Well, as I was saying, decades ago, the international financial elite that runs the Western world decided that the U.S. would no longer be allowed to maintain its status as the world's greatest industrial democracy. This goes all the way back to the Civil War and even before, when the nation was founded. But we have been under attack ever since then, and what we're seeing today through the deindustrialization of the United States, where the only way to float the U.S. economy has been through debt, through bubbles, and the latest and the last one really being this housing bubble. This has all been part of that process of taking down the United States as the world's greatest industrial democracy. Now, to prepare the mind of people, there have been nonprofit groups that have been working for decades to give us an educational system where everybody is dumbed down and everybody is fed the kind of collectivist propaganda that is contrary to the principles that were used when this country was founded. You've got foundations like the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, because what they were planning to do was to create an environment of perpetual warfare where the only way people would accept a constant atmosphere of state terrorism as normal was by having an enemy to frighten people into voluntarily giving up their rights and accepting the legitimacy of a slave society. And a key to this slavery was a financial system based upon debt, because it was the financiers who were the architects and the expected beneficiaries of the planned system. And it's the same people who created the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Now, the 1970s was the critical decade in all this, because it was then that the financial elite, working through the OPEC nations as their instruments of change, wildly inflated the worldwide price of oil, and it drove the U.S. economy into stagflation. And to combat that, the financial elite, working through the Federal Reserve and its chairman, Paul Volcker, raised interest rates through the roof, and this caused the economy to crash in the recession of 1979 to 1983. Since then, our economy has run solely on financial bubbles. We had the merger-acquisition bubble of the 80s. We had the dot-com bubble of the 90s. And then when that collapsed, we had Alan Greenspan's housing bubble of the 2000s. The purpose of the housing bubble was to allow George W. Bush to fight his wars of conquest in the Middle East. The bubble resulted in a tremendous inflation of housing and real estate prices that is unraveling today, but even though housing is still coming down, it's still so overpriced that many people who once could afford to buy a home no longer can do that and can't even get credit because